Morning, everybody. I'll give folks a few seconds to come on, but glad to have you here for this episode of TIG Talks. And as always, this is your event, not ours. It's your opportunity to ask those questions that are top of mind, raw and unfiltered, and in a casual way. So today, I just felt it was just critical that we have this conversation given where we are in the world, and what I see and what many see is this amazing moment in time where awareness and shift and anger are all leading towards and pointing towards change. And as we do that, though, there's been a lot, quite frankly, of you who've reached out to me and said, how do I have this conversation? How do I do it in a way that there isn't backlash, that I can, share my views both internally with my team and externally with my consumers, both as founders and brand. So I'm super lucky to have Lara join us, and so she's the co-founder, executive director of the J.E.D.I Collaborative, and I'll let her share a little bit more about what the J.E.D.I Collaborative is and what they are doing, and then we're just going to take your calls or your questions. And remember, the best way to do that is just to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can. But before we go any further, I'll give you an opportunity to share a little bit more, Lara, about the J.E.D.I Collaborative and how it all started and what the mission is.
Sure, thank you. So the short statement is J.E.D.I Collaborative launched on April 29th, so a little over 4.5 or 6 weeks ago. And it is designed as a platform for the natural products industry to lean into justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and bring that into their companies and increase the capacity for the industry to raise our game on diversity in general. And so that's the short answer. And there's a ton of information, tools, resources at JEDIcollaborative.com that are, and commitments that you can make. So as I'm speaking, you're welcome to look and learn and browse and see what's there. And I can certainly go into the why and the why we did this and how it came to be more. Is that?
Yeah, why don't we do that as more people keep coming in? So share a little bit why, and certainly you look a little bit clairvoyant now, starting launching this in April, given where we are as a nation at this point.
Yeah, lucky, but I think, the timing was good, and we've definitely seen a significant increase in interest and engagement. We were pretty worried, launching in the middle of a sheltering and COVID of any sort of engagement. The timing was tough, and we had good engagement out of the gate, and now we're the floodgates are quite open. And the great thing is that this platform is ready. It is up and running for the natural products industry to use, and I can talk more about that and the why. So we, I go a little further back and I look at the formation. I was reflecting on this of OSC Squared almost 8 years ago. I didn't realize that the entire time I was on this J.E.D.I journey, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, this learning journey for myself. And I think a lot of times we don't know the journey we're on until a little bit later, and I'm still on that journey. But when I started OSC, I've been in the natural products industry for close to 24 years now. More on the sales, marketing, GM side, and a number of companies. And then about 8 years ago, I co-founded OSC Squared with Ahmed Rahim, who is the co-founder and CEO of NewMeT. And we did this because we observed that a lot of companies and CEOs in the industry had incredible missions and integrity in themselves and in their food. And it was also really hard to grow and invest so much in our supply chain and the food system, and also our top line in our marketing. And so we wanted to figure out how can we support each other to grow, and how can we really also look at big, hard systems level problems in food and natural products and address those by coming together. And so it really is about building more regenerative business models and agricultural systems. But what I didn't really realize and reflect on until much later is when we got together, it was 9 of us in my dining room in the Bay Area. 9 of us, and 7 were white male CEOs. And the 2 others, Ahmed and I, he's a person of color, and I was the female in the room. And we brought this together. And what I realized is Ahmed really saw, I think, as being an other growing up and being born in Iraq and coming to the United States and being constantly an other, seeing things from a different perspective and recognizing the importance of leaning in and coming together to have a chance to really grow. And I think that his perspective and maybe mine as being a little bit of outsiders was what brought OSC together in the first place. And there are many more stories of that. In 2015, we had another meeting where I was the only, it was kind of a weird meeting where we had, again, probably 13, 14 CEOs come together, and we invited a group of scientists in to talk about climate change. And there were two of us who were women, and we also happened to be in this strange moment where we had our 3rd children. The other woman was the co-founder of Happy Family Baby Foods, and I, our 3rd children, and we were in the room listening to these scientists talk about the gloom and doom of climate change as we were actually actively nursing with our covers on, because we hadn't done this before, but we felt like, if we were together, maybe we could be brave enough to bring our kids and nurse and introduce the babies to the other people in this network. And so I think just being in the room listening to this in this different way gave us a different perspective, a personal perspective, a more sensitivity, and an impetus to think about how does this impact us more broadly and what can we do? And from that moment, that frankly was the moment where we started to, without knowing it, birth what is now the Climate Collaborative. And so Jessica and I are the co-founders of the Climate Collaborative, and that project then really it's grown and taken off, and I imagine some folks who are on the call are a part of that and have made commitments. But what really sat with me when I even got up to launch the Climate Collaborative at Climate Day 2016 was that women, there was a missing piece, which was the biggest piece. Empowerment of women and education of girls wasn't something that we could get at through environmental solutions, yet it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, solution to climate change. And so I sat with that, and then about a year later, Cheryl Laughlin, who is an OSC member and at the time was the CEO of Rebel, and before that, Cliff Bar and Plum Organics, was also sitting with it. And sort of we came together, and she asked this question that really was like this aha moment. Sometimes we have these aha moments where you're like, wow, this is something we can't back down from. She asked this question when at an OSC meeting, we were talking about biodiversity and how biodiversity is so important and how do we lean into that more. And she asked, aren't humans a part of biodiversity? And as we thought about it, and I started to really look around in Future Expo West and listen to these kind of comments and hums around, wow, it feels a little bit like a country club here. It's pretty privileged and pretty white, frankly. When you start to hear that, it's hard to not see that it's a pretty homogenous group. And that is not by any intentional design, but it's how we are at this moment. And it's also who we market to. And so we started to ask ourselves a question in OSC, what does that mean for our industry long term? And what we've learned along the way is without those others, that diversity of perspective, we miss big aha moments. We miss other different perspectives. We miss sparks of innovation. And that is something that we really started to wonder, what could that mean? We also know that we are, in our consumer base, incredibly, frankly, white and higher socioeconomic level in terms of who typically buys natural and organic products. Yet our country, will be majority minority in the next 20 years. And we are now starting, as of now, right now, every second baby in the US is a baby of color that is born. So how do we as an industry really address a changing, basically demographic for our nation, and ensure the next generation growth? So that was one of the questions we sat with. And the other is, it's just the right, it's just like we're not bringing the voices in that we need to actually ensure the vitality and the thriving of our industry, without embracing more diversity. So that's really how it was born. And along the way, the J.E.D.I Collaborative, of course, is we're doing quite a bit to also empower, increase the voices of those who are marginalized, and figure out ways to bring them in and make the natural products industry inclusive and a place that everybody belongs and feels they belong. I'll just say one last note. And it was I was speaking to someone who is an African-American woman who very, very qualified, and it really has done incredible things in our industry. And she even commented, when I go to Expo West or anything, I feel like I almost give them a high five, like a visual high five to every other African-American there, because I only see like a couple in the whole, and so I feel like I don't feel like I belong. I feel like I have to work a lot harder, but I've been lucky enough to get there. And that understanding that that's the feeling. And once what I've seen this with our industry, once there is a consciousness of an opportunity to raise our game, I've seen it again and again with non-GMO, with fair trade, with climate change. We step up in a big way. And so this is our moment to raise our game when it comes to J.E.D.I and our consciousness there.
Well, I mean, there's so much to say here, but I mean, one of the things that just stands out, what you just said, is that as an industry, when it enters our consciousness, when we have awareness, we react. And I know, as someone who's been in this industry now for, I'm going to date myself and really how old I am, but 30 plus years now, in my mind, we were always inclusive. We were, but when it was actually brought to my consciousness, and I looked through new eyes, I recognized that wasn't the case. That was a narrative that I could use, but it wasn't the case. And I agree wholeheartedly that this industry has a history of accepting its imperfections and accepting, where and when it needs to change. And I feel like this is one of those inflection points. And that's what excites me so much about the J.E.D.I Collaborative, and why, we plan to support it, as a business as well. Just another question, and again, please, anyone who wants to, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We want this to be more directed towards your questions than mine, but I'll pitch in for now. A question just in terms of this heavy lifting. This is a huge lift, that you are trying to take on. How do you see that working? How are you going to get the kind of traction, or how do you hope to get the kind of traction with what you're trying to change, and with J.E.D.I's mission from the rest of the industry?
Yeah, it is a huge lift. And I've heard this before. When I was working on the Climate Collaborative, I heard from almost every CEO, so we were pitching, we're going to do it. We're going to do something on climate change for the industry. And every single person said, that's too big. That's too broad. Take on one piece, take on food waste, take on packaging, which we were already doing with the OSC Packaging Collaborative. And but it's not that, but when you're dealing with a systems level problem, and this is a systems level challenge, you need to meet it with a systems level solution. And with the Climate Collaborative, we have over 650 companies who've committed, who've made commitments in 3 years. It's blown me away. I mean, we've definitely exceeded our expectations, and not just made commitments, but are actively engaging together. So with the J.E.D.I Collaborative, how are we going to do this? JEDIcollaborative.com, as I said, is live. It is available and up for the industry. And there's a lot of hows, but I'll start with the how do we, where are we at, and where will we go? So we, first of all, did a benchmarking study that Carlotta Mast and New Hope partnered with OSC on in the J.E.D.I Collaborative. And we completed that in the beginning of this year with about 250 companies. Not perfect, because we know that, a lot of times the companies who are doing the best work are the ones who responded to this survey on diversity. But what we learned is that within our industry, about 2% of our industry leadership and boards are represented by African Americans, which is, a lot less than the population, which is over 13%. We learned that about 2% of our boards are represented by Latinx, and 6% of leadership, which is far less than the demographic in our country. Women are doing a bit better. And it's a very and there are a lot of women in the industry, and I'm not blind to the fact that I'm a white female, and there are a lot of us, and we're actively bringing in a lot more differentiation and diverse voices in the J.E.D.I Collaborative to address that. But I'll just go into on the women's side. When you're looking at a small company, a company of about 10 people to a company that are under 50. Women in leadership and on boards are doing pretty well. When you get to companies of over 50 employees, we see a pretty big drop off. There's about 23% board representation of women. I would challenge that. Again, I think it's a little less, because I think a lot of the companies who responded tended to have more women on their boards already. But we know that, that's still underrepresentation, given how strong the influence of women are in our industry, in terms of consumers. And that perspective is so important at every level, including the board level. So we have some baseline benchmarks for a lot of different demographics for our industry. Our goal is to radically shift that. So every 2 years, we will continue to benchmark and look at big shifts and in measurements in 2025 and 2030, ultimately to go for 2030 looking like the US population. So how can our industry look like the US population in terms of demographics? That's the big goal. The other big goal is that by 2025, we will have generated 2,025 J.E.D.I collaborative commitments to action in the industry. And the industry and many companies have already shown their ability to do this. And we know that making commitments and having a network of companies to learn from together and best practices and solutions works. It raises our game. So that is essentially how the J.E.D.I Collaborative is. There's a lot there, but the baseline is we have a whole J.E.D.I journey and a path to action. You can see the how of J.E.D.I on JEDIcollaborative.com. Where it starts with
in the chat box for everybody. So
yeah, thank you. And it starts with first and foremost getting your leadership and CEO engaged. And we've seen that again with many kind of let's say diversity busts and where something backfires and a company hires a big chief diversity officer, but it's sort of just this thing over here in HR. It's not integrated into the company and prioritized and understood by the CEO. So that's the first thing, is to have the CEO actually agree that this is important. And then make a J.E.D.I statement, and then go on and make J.E.D.I commitments. We have been working with, excuse me, a team of experts. One group is called the Avarna Group, who they are brilliant, and they are diversity experts for over 2 years. A long team of advisors you can see on our JEDIcollaborative.com website to build this platform. It is based on science and the best-in-class knowledge of what are the commitments that companies need to make to be able to be successful. With achieving diversity in a meaningful way in their companies. And so there are 3 different buckets: consumer, culture, and community. So in the culture bucket, that is about making company culture commitments to J.E.D.I. And it could be anything from hiring for a more diversity. And there's lots of simple things. We already have tricks. And Rebel, for instance, one of the simplest things they did is they just marked out the names on their resumes they were taking. So there wasn't any kind of unconscious bias of names before really seeing the talent and the skills of those people. There are all kinds of interview hiring best practices, and also universities and places to go recruit that are different than the standard schools. I can go on and on about that, but we've seen and heard a lot of studies that if you consider that person who might have gone to, let's say, UC Merced instead of UCLA, and they grew up first generation Latinx or African American family, poor. They worked their way through. And they have against many odds, and maybe a community that was not as exemplary for them in terms of others going to college, have made it to college and have been successful there. That person has shown, that kind of person again and again is shown to potentially be a much stronger employee, staffer, entrepreneur than someone who was kind of handed an easier path. And so when we start to think in that way, we realize there are a lot of opportunities out there that our industry is missing. So those are, I'm going on and on a little bit, and happy to field other questions, but there are many commitments that can be made, and some of them, there are a lot, but the first and second, third, fourth steps, actually, if you take it in steps, not that hard.
So a question around that. So most of our audience, we have a pretty shy one evidently today. Most of our audience is, early stage founders. So how do they make this commitment early?
Well, this is the perfect time to make the commitment. So the founders themselves, first, you can make J.E.D.I commitments, and we encourage you to make a J.E.D.I statement. We have a whole webinar on how to make a J.E.D.I statement, very simple, but it basically frames up your thinking. What am I going for? What do I want to accomplish with J.E.D.I? Is it inclusive hiring? Is it more diverse boards? Is it a supply chain where we embrace and uplift those in our supply chain more and really think about the vendors that we work with? So there are many different areas. So we encourage you to make a J.E.D.I statement. All of this is set up. So a lot of times people say, well, I don't have the resources or the time or the funding to be able to bring in someone to do this for me. All this is set up. So they're very simple steps and just a set of thinking that you can go into. It's set up for entrepreneurs that are just starting their companies and early on their journey. So really start by making that J.E.D.I statement, making a commitments in the area that matter to you most. And then participate where you want to. This can be done on your own J.E.D.I journey, but there will be in our already active webinars and tools, case studies, resources along the way. And for companies who are really leaning in and are successful, we're ready to showcase and spotlight. And New Hope is a very deep partner of ours, and this is a big intention to be able to make this a real focus for our industry and a celebration. And I will just give you a sneak peek. I can't tell who, but we're just signing the MIU. There are some big distributors and retailers who are leaning into this with us. And it will be a part of the real lens in thinking of how companies can really differentiate themselves longer term.
We just started our J.E.D.I journey. We're working on our commitment and our statement. And I'll just tell you that just the conversation that comes from it, and it's caused us to do everything, is to relook at even our application and the information we ask for and get, and the levels of commitment and so forth. It's fantastic. And we're also going to, there's also a way, by the way, for anyone interested, especially any service providers, to donate, to put your money behind this as well. And we're going to be doing that too. Another question, just a little bit more general, is that, we're in this moment in time where this is obviously top of mind for everybody. And what guidance, what suggestions do you have? I've been getting lots of questions from people about, how do I respond on social media? Do I post? I don't feel like I have, the voice to post, or do I not post? What happens if I don't? And all of these kind of questions. And my guidance for whether that's right or wrong, as a middle-aged white guy, I don't necessarily have the best perspective here, but my guidance has been that a brand is a emotive extension and has its own voice, and being is to be true to that voice, and is to just speak truth. And if there's backlash to that truth, then that's okay. But I'm just curious as to your guidance.
Yeah, and I think we're all on this learning journey together. So I first want to say that I am not a J.E.D.I expert, but I will tell you what I'm seeing and what we're learning and discussing together. I'm a natural products industry person that is bringing in experts to support us. We actually had this conversation yesterday with about 30 of our 37 OSC member companies. What do I do with our strategy group, the Avarna group? As it's definitely on top of mind. And the first thing I think to think about is exactly what you said, Elliot. Is it authentic to post? And I'm seeing that there's a little bit of hesitancy now. And I expect this community is largely non-diverse, and so there's a nervousness, like, I don't want to mess up. And then there's these new terms we've heard, like performative allyship, where suddenly someone is out putting posts, social media posts, we support Black lives, and posters of Black Lives Matter, and really kind of creating a lot of noise in social media without backup of authenticity or action. And there's been some real backlash against that, because it's dampening the voices of the people who actually are living these experiences and have something to share and deserve are actually listening and our empathy at this point. And so I think it's a really careful balance. Yet most companies are struggling because they're like, well, everybody's saying something, so I've got to say something now. What do I do? And so, first of all, I saw like Ben & Jerry's is really leaning into this work. And so they made a great statement, and they can back it up with authenticity. So that kind of like a statement makes sense from that standpoint. I saw Anne Marie Cosmetics, who is a OSC member company, made a statement that was a little different. And I thought that was really where most people and brands should go at this point, unless you're already deeply participating in J.E.D.I. They acknowledged that we have a lot to learn. We need to continue to increase the diversity of our team and embrace our new consumers. And we celebrate those companies owned and operated by African Americans. And then they, instead of saying anything else about themselves, shared and promoted 8 different African American beauty and natural products companies that they admired to their entire social media base, which is pretty extensive because they're a very online community. And so I thought that this is a time to be generous. And that was more of a generous statement, and thinking in that way right now versus trying to call attention to ourselves when unless you're truly doing something impactful, it's not. So really, overall, what we're talking about within OSC and J.E.D.I, and I really advise companies, is this is the time to listen and look inward and do your own work. Ijeoma Oluwa is, she's the brilliant author of So You Want to Talk About Race, and she keynoted our launch to the leadership of the industry a month and a half ago. Her video on this talk is posted on JediCollaborative.com homepage, and she's stunningly amazing and beautiful, and she's like this luminous, sensitive, soft woman, and just hard as can be on us at the same time, which I thought was a beautiful combination. And she said, this is the time to clean your own house. And if you want credit for cleaning your own house, get in the back of the bus. That's just what we need to do. And so this is really a time to listen to your employees and start to think about internally how to make changes versus making external statements, unless you truly have something authentic to share.
And I think that's, I mean, you said a few really key things to me. I mean, one of my favorite words, and it's something that I talk about as being a superpower just in general, which is empathy.
Mhm.
And you know, I think a lot of people feel like they have to say, they have a FOMO of the FOMO of not saying or not being present.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true at all. But if you feel just, you know, that you want to participate in this dialogue online, but you don't necessarily have a specific, you know, statement to make or anything that's going to ring authentic, one suggestion I would make is just make a listening offer. You know,
Mm.
at this
Yeah.
moment, brand, we don't have much to contribute to the dialogue other than a willingness and openness to listen, because that's
Mhm.
really what needs to happen. And you made that point before. Just being a vessel to listen, to hold that is a really important thing. And that does not ring inauthentic if you're willing to do it. And then, you know, you're inviting dialogue and you're inviting conversation and you're inviting potential criticism. And
Yeah.
instead of feeling you have to respond or defend to that criticism, you should use that as an opportunity to improve your messaging as well in response. So,
Yeah.
a couple other questions, since we've definitely have a shy audience there, and I'm not surprised because I do feel like a lot of people are uncomfortable with how to voice this, and
Mhm.
regardless of where you are, have this conversation. I think from a, you know, as people, I think we're less reluctant. As brands trying to protect our position, unfortunately, we tend to sometimes cower in these things. So,
Mhm.
um, from a perspective, when a brand does get backlash, when they do get pushback from their statements, any suggestions on how they navigate that?
Um, I think we've seen that a lot, and I think it's openness, vulnerability, transparency, and like we've seen with in humility. Because and I want to encourage that with this. Again, I do not profess to be an expert or even a role model myself in this work, nor do most of us. And so I think as an industry, um, first of all, I, like I don't. It really, I find it kind of sad and upsetting when someone gets really called out in a negative way for not, being appropriate in their wording if they're trying their best. It's the and so I just want to encourage in this, like, in this environment here, this is in J.E.D.I in general, it's about actually creating a place of support and safety to come together and raise our games. In terms of what to do if you get backlash, I think it's just that being open, acknowledging um, that we're not perfect, and we're on this journey, and you're on this journey, and we all are. And here are some things we're now looking at and learning to do. For unconscious bias is the buzzword now. So J.E.D.I Collaborative has a whole webinar already pre-recorded with interaction that you can go and download and say, so I'm taking an unconscious, so I and my team are engaging in unconscious bias training with people we trust and experts, or that can be done anywhere. And or whatever the challenge is, or looking at our hiring practices and aiming for more inclusive hiring practices, and pointing out one or two ways that you might be looking at continuing to grow your company in that way.
Couple other questions around that. You know, for somebody who, you know, and I'll just share, you know, I'm full kimono. I'm fine with being vulnerable and open. I mean, you know, this is a conversation that used to be hard for me to have because I am a product of white privilege. There's no doubt about it. Part of my mind, you know, part of my internal dialogue and justification was, you know, growing up culturally Jewish and being very aware of anti-Semitism. I felt like I had that some degree of experience of othering, but that's not really true. That's just narrative or or a
Yeah.
discussion. So for a long time, I struggled with how do I, put voice to this? How do I stand for change and ring authentic? And what I've learned personally over time is that the best way to do that is to be vulnerable and is just to listen. And it's okay not to have a strong opinion or ability to be truly empathetic, because you don't know what it's like to walk a mile in their shoes. You have no idea. And then the other thing I look at is, I have 3 kids. 2 of them are powerful women. One of them just had a baby who's a baby of color. So there's that too that brings that forward to me. But just overall, for those that don't know how to engage, or who are cognizant or wary that they don't have the right perspective or place to be a part of this conversation, what advice, what have you heard from those experts that you work with? What counseling can you offer?
Yeah, well, I think I know, and I believe one of your last talks you talked with Ryan Pintado-Vertner a little bit about empathy and vulnerability, and which I think is powerful. And I think there's, he has a professional lens. Folks like Brene Brown are starting to bring this up in ways for us to like learn and think about. And there's some good stuff out there. I can't, again, to be an expert on this, I can't profess to be, this is hard work. I mean, for me, this was only a few years ago that I realized, wow, vulnerability is actually a power. It's a strength. It's not a weakness. And I grew up thinking very differently. And I grew up a product of, frankly, white privilege as well. And going to, in Huntington Beach, California, upper middle class, and then a good school for college, another good school for grad school and beyond, and moving into the CPG world. And it's all about sometimes a different way of thinking, very much about how do I like the competitive matrix, Michael Porter's model, like really just focused on what's my point of difference and how do I ruthlessly focus on that one thing and how do I do that as myself. And these are skills that I didn't learn. And most of us didn't learn if we're like a child of the 70s and 80s. Which a lot of us are. I see the next generation being a little different. I noticed even my daughter, my 11-year-old, maybe not so much, she's more, but my 9-year-old and my 5-year-old, wow, they're teaching me about empathy and listening. And they're being taught that in school, to respect difference and to listen and to apologize and to hold space. I mean, there's still, it's something that can be learned, but it's a little bit wired into us culturally. And so this is being, expecting people to be vulnerable and be good at it. I think we all need to actually be vulnerable and giving ourselves the chance to learn to be vulnerable and not be really good at it. There's a much deeper conversation here that I'm really starting to research, and I'm not seeing a lot out there about. But if you think about it, I mean, I'm reading this whole, like one of the first books on indigenous culture and the Native American Indians. And because, it wasn't something I learned in school. Now my kids are, they're learning about the Native American Indians instead of the missions. I mean, I learned about the missions, what a flip, and how great the missions were. Now it's completely different, but there's something there that the backbone of our country is kind of a scary thing to really look deeply at. And once we start to look deeply at it, it starts to dismantle some of the ways we think about ourselves. Colonizing, that's being colonial. That's considered a kind of a romantic word. Colonizing means taking what's not ours and extracting and using what wasn't given to us or offered to us. It was taken. And so we took a country, we built it on the backs of other people, and we did a pretty good job of that. And then there's a point, we see this with, I'm also reading Collapse, which is another book from a few years ago, around every civilization runs up against their limits. We've had a much longer run rate because we've had a much bigger, a more forgiving empire in our nation and now globally to allow us to do that. But we're starting to hit our limits. And then you either don't thrive, or you change. And that is, I think, the natural, I mean, not to put too much pressure on us, but I really think the natural products industry and food is a nodal point for the culture of our country and the world to change. This is why I do this work. We are such an important place to create ripple impact for change in thinking. We grew up and we learned to basically suppress our feelings and our vulnerability. And I truly believe a lot of that was because we need, as a nation, we needed to disconnect from the people that we took things from to be able to justify what we did and what we've done. And that disconnection has created a big wall. And now I'm going off a limb here, because then maybe this is what you want, because we don't talk about this stuff at J.E.D.I, but I do think we need to get to this point somewhere along the way, which is we have kind of built a wall around ourselves to justify and to protect our power. And there's a point, then you look at us and you realize, have we reached the limit of our power? Number one, we've been talking about this for a while, but I think the Mother Earth is starting to give us a big feedback piece. I mean, we talk about global warming being a gift because it's actually a massive feedback loop to say, change, because you will not live if you don't change. I'm giving you the signal. And there are many other signals like this now from the human side, that being very siloed and being, I think there's a lot of, it's not in us, but adapted narcissism, adapted egomania, because I don't think we're necessarily like that, but we've almost needed to be that way to adapt to the system, which has grown in this in a manner that the only way we can keep it going, we think, is to defend our power in our space.
Yeah, so much of it has to do, I agree with you wholeheartedly with power. And one of the things, I've been trying to make sense, and I'm going to take the risk of being semi-political here, trying to understand the madness of all the shit that we're going through and what's going on. And I do self-justify that, if you look historically, the greatest periods of change come post the greatest periods of disruption, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I think is very interesting that I just find curious, and we have a few questions, so I'm going to jump to that in a second. But that is, I feel like the veneer has been pulled from our surface a bit. We are now in this moment of time where we can't help but see that as a nation we're deeply flawed, and because we can see that we're deeply flawed now, we can accept that we always have been. Whereas before, we did such a good job of our own national narrative about being the perfect nation, the perfect union, that it was very difficult to go backwards and see all the things we screwed up along the way. But now that we see that we're wildly dysfunctional, we can also own that current dysfunction and all of our prior dysfunction, and that excites the hell out of me. I think that's where change is going to come from, where we're not having to try to defend or sweep things or justify things that were awful. We can just own them as awful. A couple of questions. The shyness is lifting in our last few minutes. Manuel asks, what do we tell people that are flipping the conversation and saying that those who complain about systematic racism are just placing blame on others for their own failures? Great question, Manuel.
Those who complain about systematic racism are placing blame on
for their own failures.
That's a big question. I don't know if he can give more perspective on that, or you can. But that, I just want to pause for a minute and hold that, because there is a lot of blame, and I think we all see that. I almost wonder if we look more at the word blame itself. Blame itself is a defensiveness, a defensive mechanism for avoiding vulnerability. It is a protective measure, and usually it comes from anger, which is usually masking sadness underneath it. And so I don't know that I'm giving you a good answer as much as what I believe is deeper psychologically, which is those are people who haven't been brave enough to look at themselves and their own vulnerability yet, and overcome that. And they might almost deserve to be handled like a child, because that's a lot of folks aren't ready. They're still in a childlike phase with this.
Blame in my mind is blame in my mind is another form of othering. It's another
Yeah.
form of deflecting ownership for our culpability in where we are. And the reality, again, in my perspective, is we all own a part of that culpability. Nobody's above ownership on it as a whole. And so blame, I don't know that there's benefit to blame, and that's how I would respond. I don't know that there's benefit to blame. There's benefit to talking about progress. There's benefit for talking about how do we move forward together, those type of things. Manuel goes on to say, some people say that minorities are placing blame instead of owning their success or lack of it. So, and I'll give you a second to think about that, but I think, again, that's deflection. That's a it's people who feel vulnerable that they're giving up power if they admit that that exists. And so, again, this is my opinion. I'm furthest from the expert, but
I think that I'm hopeful, and maybe I'm a little idealistic that is starting to shift, but I agree with that. I'll even admit that I've felt that way growing up. I think a lot of us have, and it requires getting to a place of empathy to actually understand that, especially African Americans and Indigenous people, many people we call it BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and different people of color, have experienced a lot of I think there's different groups, but those people were many brought here. They landed here against their will. Not everybody, but and systematically, when you really look at their lives, that's hours of conversation. But if I even think about our industry, like it didn't really hit me. And I'm speaking to, and we have this on our launch video, one of the women who is the founder of Kube Ice Cream, a coconut ice cream company, talked about, and this is when it really hit me. I have been trying to raise money and I know my product is great, and I know I'm smart, and I work so hard, but I've been trying to raise money for the last 4 years, and people won't lean in. And I realized that I didn't grow up in the community. I don't have the friends and family to give me that first $500,000. I don't have the network that a lot of people have. I had to work so hard to even get to a point to have anyone hear me. And so there's this almost like weariness where it's like they have to work 3, 5, 10 times as hard to even get to the point of being at the table with us. And they're already tired when you think of that. And that's, when you kind of hold space for that, how much harder they're already working to even be able to be at the table. That there's like, then give them a voice. Let them be heard and listen to their perspective, because oftentimes, when I actually listen, I'm blown away at what I can learn. But we haven't just learned to shut up and listen. And that's one of the biggest powers we can start to have.
So true. One last quick question, because I know also you have a time, and then I want to give you an opportunity just to make sure folks know how to reach out if needed. But Beth asked if you have any suggested reading lists or anything along those lines for those that want to dig a little deeper and spend a little time contemplating and getting a better understanding. Any books or suggestions?
Yeah, and they're on JEDIcollaborative.com. We have a reading resource list, and a lot of other resources, some cool stuff. So you want to talk about Race by Ijeoma Oluwa is a good one. And again, you can get her Cliff Notes by watching the video at our launch too. White Fragility is another good book. But I also encourage you to there's reading, and then there's also sort of just personal development and thinking and listening and balancing that with both. And what also, it depends on how this reaches you. I mean, I found, frankly, when I brought this to the OSC CEO network, some were like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. We need to lean into it. And others were really more moved by, wow, I didn't know that, which we think we all know. When you look at the McKinsey and the Harvard Business School studies and all these different research pieces and Forbes and now Goldman Sachs, that even reading this stuff to realize that without a lack of diversity of perspective in your company will hold you back. That is just plain and simple. And there are so many studies about that. It may not seem like that short term because decisions are easier. Things go in, there's the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, and go together with a broad group with broad perspective, because there are so many, and they're all on our website, JEDIcollaborative.com, but studies that show that innovation revenue is significantly higher when you have more diverse teams, that growth is higher. Goldman Sachs recently stopped taking any company public that did not have diversity on their boards, a clear set of diversity and their leadership teams. And they said this had nothing to do with it being a public statement play. It was because they looked at companies that they took public in 2006, 2007, before the last recession. And those with more diverse teams significantly outperformed those through the recession and were significantly more resilient and significantly higher valuation than those with less diverse teams. So we see that. So there's, so I encourage you to read different things to understand that this is not a one trick pony. This is a systems level challenge we face, and the solutions are systems level, but we've mapped it out. So it can be one step at a time. Just take one piece if you want, but start to understand it and absorb it personally. And the more you do, the more you will see that it really leads to greater success for companies.
I want to give you a moment, the last moment, because I promised you by 56 minutes after the hour,
Yeah,
we would end, and we're at 54. So I'm going to own but first of all, Lara, thank you. Thank you, one, for being here. Thank you for doing this heavy lifting. I commit that I'm, and TIG as a whole are agreeing to be an active participant and want to help the J.E.D.I Collaborative, and also want to be part of this dialogue, and I believe everyone here does. But any last words of wisdom, or if anyone wants to reach out, is it best just to go to the website, and I'll let you end?
Yeah, and I mean, my email, Lara at osc2.com, or is right there on the website. You can reach out to me, or just go to JEDIcollaborative.com, and you can start making commitments. I mean, it's free. It's all designed. We've invested a lot of time and money to get it to this point, because we believe it's really important for the industry to start to embrace. So that's the first thing you can do. And we'll be making some announcements likely next week. We really want it to, the industry deserves some good news, and we all deserve some good news. It's been really tough. And J.E.D.I Collaborative is, as of, or actually right before all of the, national trauma we faced with racial unrest, we achieved full funding of the project. We've been careful to not announce that publicly, because since then, the need and the engagement and the acceleration of this project has increased. So we're now looking for another $75,000 on top of that. But so we're basically announcing next week that we are majority funded. The project is available, and it will continue to grow significantly for the industry and on behalf of the industry. And so if you make commitments prior to that announcement to the entire industry next week, you'll get recognized as one of the companies who've early on made commitments and is starting to lean into this work. Right. So please consider making commitments.
Clock's ticking for us. We better get our act together and get it done.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, it is 11:55 and 37 seconds. So I'm going to let you, or 10:55. I'm going to let you go. And thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Really
Thank
appreciate
you for having me and leaning into an important, kind of difficult topic together. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.